Sono felice oggi di presentarvi Rachel Turner, che è il direttore finanziario del DFID, l'ufficio che si occupa del Foreign Aid della Gran Bretagna. Presenterà appunto questo seminario su cosa fa la Gran Bretagna riguardo all'aiuto allo sviluppo, come sono organizzati, come è cambiata la politica dell'aiuto allo sviluppo negli ultimi anni. La lezione sarà in inglese. Cercherò di parlare particolarmente piano e ci sono anche le slide, quindi spero aiutino, ma se qualcuno di voi ha problemi a seguire con l'inglese posso ogni, non so, 15 minuti magari fare un breve riassunto di quello che ha detto, magari mi dite voi, a un certo punto magari la fermo, mi dite voi come state seguendo. Alla fine del seminario ci sarà la possibilità di fare domande, anzi vi pregherei di chiedere tutto quello che gli viene in mente, non solo sulle cose che ha detto, magari altre curiosità riguardo alla politica inglese dell'aiuto allo sviluppo, eccetera. Ad esempio anche come si accede a questa occupazione internazionale. Ci sono, how many Italians are there in DFID? Italians working for DFID? Ci sono già 10 italiani che lavorano per il DFID, che è un ufficio tra l'altro abbastanza nuovo, quindi è aperto all'occupazione di tutti i cittadini europei, compresi gli italiani, che lavorano e vengono mandati in giro per il mondo da questo centro appunto per gli aiuti londinese. Sono molto felice che sia qui Rachel, perché ho tentato di invitare endless amount of times, un numero infinito di volte a fare questa lezione. Finalmente l'organizzazione è riuscita e quindi lei è qui, quindi vorrei che ne approfittasse appunto per ogni curiosità. Ha fatto una carriera internazionale lunghissima, ha vissuto quasi 20 anni in Africa, tra Mozambico, Malawi e altri vari paesi che mi sono dimenticata. È stata capo dell'ufficio inglese per l'aiuto allo sviluppo in questi vari paesi in Africa. Adesso è un po' di tempo che risiede a Londra e a Londra lavora e forse rimarrà adesso finalmente stabile. Quindi ha proprio tanta esperienza sul campo e anche per questo sono contenta che sia qui. Non è solo una burocrate londinese, ma ha vissuto lunghissimi anni, tanto vero che ha sposato con malawiano, quindi sono proprio l'Africa ce l'ha nel cuore. Lascio la parola a the talk to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to speak in English. Francesca assures me that you can understand my English, but you must stop me if you're not understanding and you need Francesca to translate. So as Francesca said, my name is Rachel Turner and I work for the UK Department for International Development. Now let me just explain what that is, because I think you don't have the equivalent government structure in Italy. So the Department for International Development, or DFID, is a cabinet level ministry with a cabinet minister, we call him the Secretary of State, who has the same standing in cabinet as the foreign minister and as the finance minister. So this was a structure that the previous Labour government put in place in 1997 because of a very strong belief that development policy needed to be run totally separately from foreign policy. And the Labour government came in and broke from the past on this particular policy and said, we want development policy to be delinked from foreign policy and delinked from trade policy. And in 1997, the Labour government then got rid of any mechanisms for using aid to boost UK exports to developing countries or to boost UK investment in developing countries. And at the time, that was a very, very contentious policy. And the then Conservative, the right-wing government, was very challenging and did not support that policy at the time. It was felt to be not particularly helpful for UK business abroad. But the Labour government then introduced a very strong commitment to grow the aid budget and a very strong focus on poverty reduction and on channeling aid funds, development funds, to the very poorest communities and the poorest people. And that commitment then was very associated with the Labour government. The new government, the coalition government that's now in power, that came into power in May 2010, has, however, kept the policy. And it's very interesting, the politics of why this new coalition government decided to keep this policy. And they've actually come in, they were campaigning before the May elections. Their manifesto had a very strong focus and a strong message on maintaining us as a separate ministry, not putting us back into the foreign ministry, and keeping the aid volumes high, and keeping the previous Labour government's commitment for our aid funds to reach 0.7% of gross national income. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this target. There is an international target for developed countries to give 0.7% of gross national income as aid. And in the past, it's really only been the Scandinavian governments who've managed to meet that target. We committed to do that back in 2000. The then Labour government committed to do that. And this new government has kept that commitment. So what I want to do today is just tell you a bit about why this new government has decided to keep that commitment in the face of the very difficult fiscal environment in the UK. It is difficult, and I'll give you some statistics about that too. Why this government has decided to keep that ambitious target, and also some of the changes to policy that we have made and the reason we've made them. And basically, the reason that we've made these changes to policy is to prove to the UK taxpayer that every pound that we spend, every euro, every cent that we spend is good value for money for the UK taxpayer. So that is the very strong policy message. And we're putting a lot of effort into explaining to the British taxpayer, to the UK taxpayer, on why we continue to believe that we're delivering good value for poor people from the aid programme. So I'll give you some more detail on that. But before I do that, I thought I would just give you some of the context of what's actually happening to poverty in the poorest countries of the world. And what I did, I went back, when I first met Francesca, it was about 1990. We met in Malawi. Am I allowed to call you Francesca? Do I have to call you Dr. Fauri? I first met Francesca in Malawi. Francesca was working for the World Food Programme. So I went back and looked at some of the statistics on what's happened to poverty since 1990. I think it's just quite interesting to see what has been working in development and what has not been working. So I haven't got that on a slide, but let me just tell you some of these things. And all of this is framed in 2000, so 10 years after I met Francesca in Malawi. In 2000, the United Nations, the 189 nations in the world, signed up to 8 goals to reduce poverty. So they're called the Millennium Development Goals, and they were a very, very powerful political, aspirational tool, but they were very powerful that there was this set of very specific 8 targets that all developed and developing countries signed up to. So they included reducing absolute poverty, so that's people who are living on less than $1 a day. So reducing the percentage of people who live on $1 a day by a half. They included targets for reducing the number of women who die in childbirth, targets for reducing the number of children who die before they're 5, targets for reducing malnutrition, targets for getting boys and girls into school, and particularly girls into school, and some other targets around the environment and around trade as well. So let me just tell you some of the headline statistics. So overall poverty rates, so this is the percentage of the world's population who live on less than $1 a day, that has actually fallen between 1990 and 2005 from 46% to 27%. But that's nearly all being driven by Asia. So in sub-Saharan Africa, poverty has only fallen from 58% to 51%. And malnutrition has virtually stayed the same. So there's this huge issue about malnutrition. Even in places where poverty is improving, it's not translating into better nutrition for children. And there's a lot of debate about why that is. There's still over 900 million people suffering from chronic hunger. Education is very interesting. There's been a big push to get kids into primary school in Africa, and that has worked. So in 1990, I think there were probably about 120 million children not in school worldwide, and that's now reduced to less than 70 million. So there's been a huge push to get millions and millions of children into primary school across Africa. Lots of issues about the quality of the education, but the coverage of education has really improved. And the other big thing since Francesca and I first met in Africa is that the death rate for children under 5 has fallen by 1/3. So compared with when Francesca was out in the villages, the chances of dying if you're under 5 have really improved a lot. Again, it's not as good in Africa, but there have been big improvements in Africa. And a lot of that has been driven by some very basic things like basic coverage of vaccination and immunization. Still, 1 out of 7 children in Africa, though, die before they're 5. So, I mean, it's still absolutely horrendous that 1 out of 7 children die. And then finally, maternal mortality. So many countries who focused on maternal mortality have managed to halve the number of women who die giving birth. And that's been amazing, but many countries have made very little progress. So there's still a major issue with maternal mortality. So that's just some of the sort of broad background on some of the things that have gone well and have gone less well. And now I want to tell you just a little bit more about the programme. So let me just take you through some of the context. So as you know, Europe is having fiscal troubles. You don't need me to tell you why that is. I think it's really important in the context of a country that's decided to stick to this aid policy to understand that we are going through a very, very difficult fiscal scenario, just like you are. The Department for International Development is the only department, the only part of the public sector who's got a growing budget. No other part of the UK public sector has a growing budget. Everyone else is having major cuts. Pensions, welfare, education is being cut. But this government decided not just to keep the development budget, but to grow it. And it's growing it by over 30%. So the budget is growing from in our fiscal year 2009, a budget of £6.6 billion. By 2014, the budget will be at £12.5 billion, which is a very contentious policy. And the government has decided to do that because it believes in it, has this absolutely strong moral sense that maintaining the development budget is the right thing to do for poor people. And the government, my minister uses this phrase over and over again, that we should not balance the books of Europe on the backs of the poor. I don't know if that translates. Yeah.
Come state seguendo? Tutto bene o devo tradurre qualcosa delle ultime cose che ha detto o siete a posto? La cosa su cui che intende ribadire è che nonostante il cambiamento politico, essendo salito al potere un governo di destra, si è mantenuto l'accento sull'importanza degli aiuti allo sviluppo, quindi non solo il governo non ha fatto alcun cambiamento riguardo all'ufficio che se ne occupa, perché è il Department for International Development, ma ha aumentato il budget, come vedete dalle cifre esposte nella prima colonna. Quindi ha fatto il governo, come ha detto Rachel, dei major cuts su tutti gli altri ministeri, addirittura tagliando anche pensioni, i fondi per la scuola, ma non ha tagliato nulla per quanto riguarda gli aiuti allo sviluppo, perché come diceva, come citava, non bisogna fare dei tagli sulle spalle poi delle persone che più hanno bisogno. Quindi l'idea è comunque, anche in questo periodo che fiscalmente è terribile anche per la Gran Bretagna, questa crisi, questa recessione, lo stesso governo, anche se di destra, ha mantenuto le stesse identiche priorità di quello che c'era del Labour Party, che c'era prima al potere. Nulla è cambiato, gli obiettivi di sviluppo della Gran Bretagna sono rimasti gli stessi, quindi che adesso non è illustrarci. Se avete seguito bene, ho ripetuto un po' quello che ho detto, forse non c'era bisogno.
So, yes, so I mean, we are in the middle of this big deficit reduction program where there are a lot of very difficult political challenges, but right in the middle of that, the aid program is being protected. And this is just some more statistics about the context. I think the key point here is that the size of the civil service, so that's the not the whole public sector, including the health service, but the core of the public sector, the central government. Now, after the 2 years of the fiscal austerity, it's the smallest civil service that the UK has had since the Second World War. The government came in and they just cut jobs and cut jobs and cut jobs. All my colleagues in other government departments, they're being cut by 25%, a third. Very sharp cuts, very quickly implemented. Again, the Department for International Development is actually, in terms of the number of people, we've been allowed to stay steady. We've had to lose a third of our administrative budget. We've had to find very tough savings, but they protected the number of posts, unlike other government departments. So it's just this very interesting political story about protecting the aid budget. And now ministers, though, the politicians have said, we're going to protect this budget, we're going to protect the size of the Department for International Development, but under certain conditions. And there are really two. The first condition is about results, that everything we spend that £12.5 billion on, we have to know what it's going to deliver. We can't just make general assumptions. We can't say it's going to help growth. We have to be absolutely clear what results for poor people are being delivered. And we have to be able to tell those stories, and we have to be able to track the results, and we have to be ambitious. So they've set us some very tough, ambitious targets, and I'll come on and talk to you about that. We also have to be able to explain to the UK taxpayer what those results are. And a lot of pressure on us all to be able to explain to the media about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And the other piece is about cost and transparency. So the other thing this government did is they came in and they said, every single invoice, everything you spend over £500 has to go on the website. And I can't tell you what that does to how you behave. As a civil servant, if you know that every single thing that you're spending money on is out there on the website for the newspaper, for the media to look at, you really do change your behaviour. And that's also been very interesting. And we have a very aggressive media, the tabloid press in the UK, And there are two newspapers who hate us, who really don't like the aid programme. And they have people looking at our website, looking for these invoices that say things like, came to Bologna for a trip, or, you know, that we have people looking. We had a terrible time last year when we seemed to have funded a dance troupe from Brazil that had come, I don't know, to another. We'd moved it from one part of Brazil to another and funded some dancers. I don't know, it was part of some education program or something. But anyway, that transparency is very scary. Everything we write now is on the website, every project document, every annual review, but it really does make you change your behaviour and make you very aware that you're spending the taxpayers' money. And a lot of focus then on cost and control. And of course, broadly, the number of posts in London has been frozen. We've been allowed to grow some posts abroad, and I'm sure, like here, as you know, we've had a wage freeze for the last, well, it's 3 years now. Wages have been frozen. So as well as those two overarching themes, one on cost, transparency, and one on results, there's also been a focus on new policy priorities. And I won't talk about all of them, but what's been very interesting is that all our ministers are Conservative. We have 3 ministers. That they've come in with a very strong focus on girls and women and on reproductive health, on family planning. And almost from week 1, when they took up office, they wanted to know how everything we did benefited girls, adolescent girls first, and women. And they have a very strong belief that supporting adolescent girls is the right way to create strong societies and strong development in poor countries, particularly in Africa and in South Asia. So very interesting. I think none of us expected that. Very interesting to have a Conservative government come in, and the first thing they ask you is, can these women in this village access the contraception that they want to? It's very interesting. And also very prepared to go to America and stand up in the States and say the same thing in quite a challenging way, which was a very interesting, I think, political decision as well. So that's been interesting. There's also a strong focus on fragile states, and of course that's partly political, but it's again about the belief that investing in places like Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, is worth doing now, that it's cheaper to invest now in developing those countries than to deal with war and conflict and all the repercussions of fragility later on down the line. But it's hard, it's very hard to spend money in a transparent and effective way in those countries. And then the final point there is about the growing relationship with China, Brazil, India and South Africa and Russia. I don't know if you use this phrase, the BRICS, yeah? With the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, with their aid programs. So it's not about poverty in those countries, it's about working with those countries in terms of how they spend money in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and that's quite a new thing for us too. So when the government came in May 2010, we spent the whole summer redesigning the whole aid programme around results, and we worked from the bottom up to come up with very specific targets. And these are now the targets that we, the senior management team in DFID, we're accountable now to the taxpayer. Well, we're accountable to ministers, and ministers are accountable to the taxpayer to deliver these targets. And ministers have stood up and said, you know, you can hold me to account. They said to Parliament, you can hold me to account to deliver these targets, and these are the main targets. It's quite hard, I think, just to look at these cold, but the fact that they're there, they're specific, there's a framework of accountability it's very challenging. We haven't been used to working like this, and it's very challenging and very interesting to do, actually. And things like halving malaria deaths in 10 of the worst affected countries. It's amazing how actually you can do these things when you've got a target. You really can organise around them, and you can work out what needs to be done with the governments there. Vaccination is fascinating. We held a big conference. In fact, Italy supports this international vaccination program as well. We held a big conference back last June when we increased our spend. We made an announcement to increase our spending on vaccination. We increased it by £800 million. It was a more than a doubling. And then we did a big survey of the UK taxpayer. We had over 80% approval rates. So this was right in the middle of the fiscal austerity programme. We were still getting 80% approval rates from polling, from surveys, that we were doing the right thing. And I think it's because people understand vaccination, they understand saving kids' lives and the benefits of that. So those are some. And the other thing we did, we closed 16 of our country programmes. So DFID has offices and country programmes all around the world, like Italy has embassies and manages small aid programmes from embassies. So we had many of these. So we took a decision to close 16 of them and concentrate on 27. So and some of those were quite difficult, tough decisions. They weren't easy. And we've kept 8 programmes. That's just a list of the biggest 6, and then it continues with programmes in East Africa and other places. But you know, it's very interesting. Democratic Republic of Congo, no real history there for the UK. We've just decided to keep a large programme just because it is such a desperately poor place. Now it's a challenge to deliver with that money. India has been very politically contentious. The fact that we've kept an aid programme in India, it's in the press nearly every week. Our minister is attacked for why he's kept an aid programme in India. But the poorest states in India are really, really poor. So the programme is concentrated on the poorest states. I don't know if you can see this. You do some work around the multilateral organisations here, Europe, the structures of Europe, and you have some phrase, this phrase, multilaterals, is that, yeah. So the World Bank, for example, is an organisation that we give money to, but we actually give money to about 40 organisations, many of them UN, United Nations organisations. So the other thing we did when the government first came in was we spent 4 months really looking in to 40 of these multilateral organisations, and we looked at how well they were managed, how well they controlled their costs, how well they behaved in country, whether they actually cared about results and good management and what they were doing. We did a whole process that was peer-reviewed by a team of academics, and we went transparent on all this with a very big report. And the organisations, they hated it. They hated it. They had never had anybody talk transparently about them, and we ranked them. So this is the ranking. So you can see, this is the Food and Agriculture Organisation in Rome, really bad down here. These are the better ones. The ILO, International Labour Organisation in Geneva. And these aren't about their policies necessarily, it's about what they actually do with their money. Do they do anything worthwhile with their money? If we give them money, are we getting any value for it on the ground?
È tutto chiaro qui, cioè una delle cose su cui tanto hanno ragionato col cambio di governo è la trasparenza. Non solo loro rendono conto di ogni 500 sterline spese nei paesi di sviluppo online, quindi trovate tutto online, oltre 500 sterline, è tutto giustificato come viene speso nei paesi che aiutano. Ma allo stesso modo il governo, siccome danno molti soldi anche alle organizzazioni internazionali che si occupano di sviluppo, ne aiutano più di 40, hanno preso le prime 40, le più importanti, hanno cercato di capire dove finiscono i soldi inglesi dati a queste organizzazioni internazionali, quindi hanno fatto un'analisi che poi è stata anche controllata, c'è stato una peer review da parte di alcuni professori dell'Università di Londra per vedere quali sono le migliori e le peggiori per quanto riguarda l'efficacia degli loro aiuti, dove finiscono i soldi inglesi dati alle organizzazioni multilaterali, che è quello che fa l'Italia oggi, non dà più tanto aiuti bilaterali, ce lo racconterà, ma lo dà soprattutto alle associazioni internazionali, ma se non c'è nessun effetto, se non sono brave a fare questo, forse smetterà di darle l'Inghilterra. Le peggiori sono quelle verso la fine, le migliori sono quelle verso l'alto. Okay.
So this is WFP that Francesca used to work.
It's okay.
So it's okay. It's kind of, it does good things, but it does, this is kind of, do we think it's trying to do things that matter, make a difference? So World Food Programme, we think it's trying to do good things, it just doesn't do it very well. It's not very well managed. It's kind of organizational. We use sort of, business organization. Yeah. Which other organizations? The European Commission. This is the main European budget here. So
There are
this,
many students who study.
yeah, students who study Europe. So actually, it's pretty poor. Doesn't. It's not very well managed. Doesn't do anything very exciting.
Sorry.
Abroad.
EU is not doing very well.
No, but Europe also has a separate fund for Africa, the
Yes.
Caribbean and the Pacific, and they manage it separately,
And that's what.
and it does much better. So the EDF, because it's managed, we say it's managed off budget, so there's the budget that as members of Europe we just have to pay for, and then this is voluntary, whether members of Europe contribute to that budget or not is voluntary. And actually, because it's voluntary, you can demand better management of behaviour. In a way, you have less control. It's quite interesting. It's subject to less scrutiny in Parliament and less control. But I think it has slightly more autonomy, and that actually means that it's run better. This is the World Bank's, and it's quite interesting that actually this European instrument we think is better run than this World Bank. This is the World Bank's fund for the poorest countries. And the main reason why the European instrument is better than the World Bank instrument is because, very interestingly, the World Bank runs a lot of its programs from Washington. The staff stay in Washington. The good thing about the European Commission is they do send their staff to country. They do staff their offices up. So when there are problems, although they might not be as professional as the World Bank, they're there, they're on the ground, they sort problems out, you see problems being solved very quickly. It's very interesting. This was not a very nice, it was very interesting, none of this, the politicians didn't interfere with this graph. They didn't like that difference very much. They were not so happy that the European organisation came out a bit better on that axis than the bank, but they understood and they accepted it.
Can I would like to understand which were, one of the important things were to be in contact with the context.
Yeah.
But which were the others?
Criteria.
Criteria.
Okay. If you can look on our website, the report is still there. So the criteria on this axis were actually this axis we included. Did they focus on girls and women? Did they were they able to work in fragile states? So when they were working in fragile states, did they have the flexibility and the tools and people to work in fragile states? Did they care about results? Were they focused on results? Did they problem solve? on here. And then on this axis, it was about, these were really straightforward issues about a well-run organization. So this was from more sort of organizational literature. And this was, and you might think, well, why would you need to do that? But many of these UN and other organizations, they're just really badly run and badly managed. So this was about, do you have a good human resources policy? Do you appoint on merit? Do you sack people who are not performing? Do you control your budget? Do you even know what your budget is? It's amazing how many of these organizations, they don't even know really where they're spending their money, what their budget is. Do you manage your liquidity well? Some of these organizations have these huge pots of cash that they don't control. I mean, it really is astounding how badly run some of them are. And some of them are run well. This is the ICRC, which is not really multilateral, it's the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross. Very effective organization based in Geneva. If you want a career, if you're looking for a job in international development, I would go for ICRC. This is the Global Alliance on Vaccines. I mean, UNICEF actually comes out well. UNICEF has managed to separate itself somehow from the other UN family, quite interesting. So anyway, look for jobs in this. Unless you want an easy. Unless you want an easy life. So these were actually, here are some of the criteria here that we just asked about. And so we did take some decisions on the multilateral side. We've withdrawn from UNIDO, which is the United Nations. We just said no, we're not getting value from our support for UNIDO, so we withdrawn. We stopped any additional funding to ILO. Our Department of Labour in the UK will still provide the core funding. UN Habitat, we stopped funding. This is a part of the UN in New York, focuses on disaster resilience. We stopped funding that, it was not effective. And then, I don't know about in Italy, but in the UK, when schools, particularly primary schools, are not performing well, the government has this phrase, special measures. So it puts the school in special measures and it says to the head teacher, you have a year to turn the school around and sort yourself. So it's quite the term is a very loaded political term. So the government told these organizations that we were putting them in special measures. And particularly to FAO and UNESCO, we've said, you've got a year to sort these management issues out or we're going to withdraw. And that really shocked them, and actually that in itself has been quite powerful. I've got that slide twice. So I talked to you a bit about the bilateral aid program, about results, about some of the policies. You can ask me more questions about that. I've talked to you about the multilateral. I just wanted to put these two slides up. I thought they were quite interesting, that you can see where the UK stands in relation to other countries in terms of the overall commitment to aid as a share of GNI. Also, I've added philanthropy on here because I think it's quite interesting to see. So for the this is America, for the United States, this dark yellow bar here, this is all the money that comes from the Bill Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller and the other foundations. So although from tax revenue they don't give so much in aid, there's a lot of philanthropy. This is Italy here, just above Korea, in terms of the share of GNI.
How much does Italy give?
0.16. And then you can see, so this is ranked by the money from tax. Here, United Kingdom, just, well, this is where we were in 2009, so we want to move up to 0.7. You can see the Scandinavian countries at the top. it goes Sweden, Norway, Luxembourg, Denmark, Netherlands, if you can't read that. Sweden, Norway, Luxembourg, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, Ireland, Finland, and then the United Kingdom. So that's quite interesting. This is the really interesting slide. So then if you look at Italy, now this is how much of the aid do they spend through other organizations, through multilateral organizations. So Italy is a very multilateral, so the dark yellow is through Europe. But basically all of Italy's aid program is multilateral, 70, I can't read that now, what that is. Sorry, even my own slides are not great. It must be about 72%, I think, in total.
72.2?
Yeah, something like that, yeah. But you can see that Italy it's the most multilateral country. Very interesting. So, I mean, this is basically a decision to really, in Italy, not have a bilateral aid program, but to continue to fund and be an active member of a range of multilateral organizations. And all those organizations I showed you on the other chart, Italy, I think Italy is a member of all of them, nearly all of them. So you're a member of all those organizations, but the last slide showed that you have a very small bilateral program. And why that matters, why do we monitor these things? We monitor them in the UK because our ministers are very sensitive to the fact that our aid program is growing and other people's is not growing. And what our ministers don't want to do is to have us take too much of a burden, too much of the share of the multilateral organisations. So they're also sensitive to the UK taxpayer and to the press and to Parliament, saying that too much of our aid is going through multilateral organisations and not enough is under our direct control, direct aid program. So we monitor these numbers and we talk to ministers about them a lot. What's very interesting at the moment is that Italy, very interestingly, Italy was in arrears to many organisations. It had promised them money and had not paid them. Very interestingly, Italy's been cleaning up the arrears. We don't really know why, with the current fiscal situation, why that's happening. We think it's partly to do with just the quality of the civil servants at the moment, that they just want to get the balance sheet cleaned up, not to be owing money. So Italy, for example, has just made some very important decisions about paying arrears to the World Bank and to the Asian Bank. We don't really understand the politics of that, but it's an interesting thing to follow. And then in some organisations, very interestingly, Italy has historically been taking a bigger share than is clear why that would be. So in the Africa Bank, Italy has quite a big share of the Africa Bank. So in the Africa Bank, actually, we sit in a constituency, we share a board seat with Italy, and Italy represents the UK in the Africa Bank, very interestingly, and does very, very well, actually, very good people who work in the Africa Bank and represent us. So, you know, it's interesting to understand these political stories. They're often very historical about why different countries are in different organisations. So, how long have I been talking? I've been talking for a long time. So listen, that's just some of the background to what's happening in the UK development programme. There's lots and lots more I could talk about, but why don't I stop and we can have some questions. Is that okay?
Okay. Yes, fine. So, would you like to take, facciamo prima una piccola pausa e poi tornate con le domande, ok? Ci pensate così, qualsiasi cosa di quelle cose che raccontate e anche di più potete chiedere, magari farci quello, 5 minute break and then come back. Okay. Grazie intanto.
Bene, quindi se avete domande lascerei la parola a voi, in inglese o anche in italiano, è lo stesso, semmai traduco. Prego.
Salve, buongiorno, sono Elisa. I'm Elisa. I work for an NGO, Italian NGO here, and for us it's very, very difficult to come posso dire, riuscire a giostrare tutto il processo che porta poi a capire bene dove vanno i fondi, che cosa comportano, e quindi sono molto e sarei molto curiosa di capire quali criteri utilizzano per riuscire a ottimizzare tutto questo. Al momento noi usiamo quasi metà del nostro tempo per certificare tutto, soprattutto per i fondi che ci arrivano dai ministeri oppure dagli enti locali. E quindi, visto questo dispendio di energie, molto spesso, ad esempio per i fondi privati, non riusciamo a farlo. Quindi quando i fondi sono privati, sono donazioni private, evitiamo di creare tutto questo processo perché quelle ore lavorative le spendiamo più a contatto con le persone che hanno bisogno, appunto.
No, it's true. I mean, I think there's two things. I mean, one is certainly when, you know, as a part of the public sector becoming more transparent, it does come with a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of effort. It really is. It's expensive. Yeah, it's right. And of course, you know, many civil servants, many of my staff, it's hard work. And even things like spelling mistakes, you know, now things have to be checked and double checked, and no, so I don't think anybody says that it's easy. And in fact, there's quite a debate as well in the UK that the Freedom of Information Act is causing civil servants to be too cautious in their advice to ministers. So there's a lively debate about that. So no, it's true, and you have to just be prepared to invest in it. The other point is that however transparent we are, it doesn't deliver transparent governments. It doesn't make the government of Ethiopia transparent, or it doesn't, you know, make the government of Malawi transparent. That's a whole separate set of issues and policies, and you need to deliver both hand in hand. There is something called the International Aid Transparency Initiative that has set up a whole series of protocols and standards for transparency that helps. They've done a lot of the hard work on how to organise your data and how to code it. And we're a member of that. I think Italy is a member, actually. I could check that. But no, it's true. It's true. You have to have the political will behind you, because the moment, I think, as civil servants, the moment if you feel your ministers and your politicians are losing confidence in transparency, then it's very easy to sort of not bother them. Yeah.
Avete una formula, non so, più efficiente magari che si possa adottare?
Yeah, no, put your taxpayer hat on. So you take your, for me, you know, it's when you're doing it and you think it's tiring and you think, but as a taxpayer, I do want to know. So you put your NGO, you put your donor hat on and things. If you give your NGO some money, then you'll be incentivized. No, I don't. It is hard work. I think you need good systems. You need systems that work, systems that make it easy. We incentivize our staff too. So all our staff, they have targets, transparency targets to meet. You know, if you no spelling mistakes, for example, then you know there's a prize at the end of the month. If none of your documents have a spelling mistake in, or none of the maths are wrong, and that kind of things, people like to feel incentivized. Good question. Very good question.
Other questions?
Yes.
My name is Riccardo, and I want to ask you in which way government and your department manage that political force or parties or moment that simply think your funds or money could be used for UK poor or European structural problem nowadays.
Well, I think it's very interesting that the politicians themselves they never talk about poor people in Great Britain, poor people in the UK, in the same way that they talk about poor people in Africa. They keep these two policies very, very separate. So the politicians absolutely keep these two things separate in all of their discourse and all of their presentation. But the public absolutely say this. And how our ministers answer that is that we are talking about extreme poverty, absolute poverty. We're talking about life and death, and they use the phrase lives saved a lot. So if you look at our ministers' speeches, a lot of the time they're saying this is about saving lives, and they just keep it in a very, very separate place. The other thing they do that brings the two parts together is they talk about the safety of the UK. So they do have an argument about investing in fragile states, investing in the security and safety of our future generations in the UK. So they have a clear argument that we're investing in a safer, more stable world, and that will benefit future generations in the UK. So that's the other political argument that they use a lot. And that's partly why they have this concentration on fragile states as well. I mean, they believe it. I mean, they absolutely believe it, but they use it a lot in their speeches and in their argument.
Other questions? Think about it. I have a question.
Can you just tell us about an example, I mean, in your career, about a state that has been helped and it has changed, and about a little bit about aid effectiveness. Has been really effective. Have you been able to witness an improvement in one state that maybe where the aid policy has changed, maybe focusing more on a category of people, or just.
Okay, well, maybe I'll talk about Mozambique. I mean, I think that maybe before I answer this specific question about the example, I mean, there is a whole challenge to us that this focus on results, this very narrow focus on results, is not the same as a focus on development. And so there is a challenge to us from many of the universities in the UK, from many NGOs as well, actually, who would say that this narrower focus on results, on getting resources to girls or getting resources to kids in school, that that is not the same as a broader focus on development, and actually is too short-termist and means that we don't do hard things, that we just choose to do the easy things. And I think that's a fair challenge. I think it's a challenge that you can debate. I think if you go to a poor country and you ask people in a village, do you want us to do the easy things first or the easy things second? They think you are mad. I mean, if there are easy things to do, then do them. But equally, how you do them, if you do them in a way that's very undermining of local political structures and local community structures, then maybe you're not creating a vibrant, sustained society for the future. So it does matter as well how you do things. And this government, the old government, the Labour government, used to put a lot of money through budgets in poor countries. So it would basically write a cheque into the budget of a government if they felt that that budget was well enough run, and then the government would spend that on schools or nurses or teachers' salaries. This government is nervous to do that because they're very concerned about corruption. Any corruption scandal will be very damaging for the wider support for aid. And it's much easier to follow the money through to the end route if you keep the money separate from the budget. It doesn't necessarily empower the political institutions in a country, though, if you keep avoiding them. If you keep avoiding the normal fiscal channels, you can disempower the budget, and then you disempower Parliament in the country. So going back to your question, I worked in Mozambique for 3 years, and that was under the Labour government. And Mozambique, I think, is an example where coming out of the war, there was a very nasty civil war in the late 80s, ended in 1994. After the war, the Mozambique government did use the development resources, the aid resources available to it very effectively to invest in rural communities, particularly to get children into school and to get some really terrible health indicators to improve them. It used a lot of money just in nurses' salaries and in teachers' salaries. And there was a lot of debate at the time that that was not a good thing to be doing, that we should be building roads or building ports. But there was a strong sense from the government that what mattered both for the health and the well-being of the population was to just invest in the machinery of state. And there were a lot of communities then that had no connection with the state at all. They just never encountered the state. They were in remote villages. I mean, if you don't have a school and you don't have a health clinic, where else do you see this? So the government felt very strongly that with communities that weren't at all in touch with the state, it was impossible to build the foundations of democracy, that you needed to have a population that was somehow enfranchised. And I think many people think that work that the Mozambique government did to rebuild schools, to rebuild the health network, was very successful and has laid the foundation for the post-war embedding of democracy in Mozambique, and then continuing to improve service delivery in Mozambique. A lot of things went wrong as well, though. I mean, I think there were lots of examples of projects and programs that didn't work so well. Land reform was another very interesting example in Mozambique, where after the war they wrote a very progressive law about land ownership that really learned from a lot of lessons about land ownership in Africa and allowed women to bequeath land rights. A very egalitarian law, but they lacked the architecture to put the law into place. I mean, they lacked the land registries, they lacked a lot of the people to go around to do the cadastral work. And slowly, I mean, that was an example where the donors realised how good the law was, didn't try to change it, had to keep some donors away because the law was very progressive, didn't actually allow for land ownership outright. And some people, the Americans, didn't like that, the fact that you just had land usage rights, but you couldn't own the land. Had to keep them away, put the law into practice, and it has been quite effective. So lots of examples. I think in terms of examples where the aid itself has turned a whole country around, I think we would tend not to claim that. I mean, I think we would tend to say more that there are examples of where, you know, effective governments have used aid resources available to them well, rather than claim that the aid has actually turned the government around. Yeah.
And also the fact that now you consider aiding girls and women more. Do you think that, I mean, has this proved effective in the past? Because I think this was something that also the UN has done in the past. But do you think really you can change things? Like giving aid to women instead, for instance, in the family?
Yeah,
directly.
yeah. I think to some extent that people are still slightly experimenting with this. I think there's a lot of, there's a book, I don't know if you know this book, it won the Economist Book of the Year last year by a woman called Esther Duflo. She's a French academic, and she focuses on randomized controlled trials. So she looks at questions like this, but through very pure, so it's social science, but using very sort of pure scientific methods, almost like medical science methods, where she and her colleagues have used randomized controlled trials to answer some of these questions. And there are some good examples there of focusing resources on girls and women and seeing results from that. A lot of it is about how you do it, I think, and about how you actually channel resources in a way to give girls and women access to assets and lasting assets, and not just current spending. I think some things are proven. I think girls' education and the impact of girls' education is quite now accepted and proven, and that educating girls, there are very clear impacts on how many children women have and when they have their first child. You know, if you want to stop having girls having their first child at 12 or 13, then education is, you know, a major determinant of delaying first childbirth till sort of 15 or 16. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Johannes. I would like to ask you if you've got also a focus on the sustainability of your projects. That means that once you are stopping your funding, they can go on by their own feet. Just remember Afghanistan, maybe now they've got good health, better health service, some girls can go to school, but after they were dying of the intervention, so when they go off Afghanistan, maybe it changes again. So how's your contact with the local?
No, I think that's a good question. Afghanistan is quite unique, I guess, in that respect, about what's going to happen to the revenue flows in Afghanistan, and I think people are quite worried that there's going to be quite a gap before some of the revenue from the natural resources in Afghanistan comes on stream, and how they're going to sustain funding. And that's why we continue to talk about the need for a large aid program for Afghanistan until resources start to flow. I think more generally in other countries, if you actually look at tax revenue from their own tax bases, which you can do, the pace at which some of the poorest countries are growing their tax base is quite surprising and is fast, and that you can actually begin to almost plot the curve at which countries' own tax revenues will allow them to pick up some of the recurrent costs of some of the aid interventions. I think many countries in Africa now discovering oil, many of the issues that are emerging about how should those countries preserve that revenue, how should they save it or spend it, very much like the natural resource issues that have been faced by countries like Norway or even the UK with our gas revenue. So you can definitely see countries that are beginning to plot sustainability, but at the same time there are huge challenges as well, because with population growth, many of the pressures on service delivery are growing very fast as well. And I think you can see a case for aid quite a long time into the future. I think what we would say is that for UK aid, we need to be very, very careful that we don't stay with aid programs in countries that can manage those services themselves and concentrate the aid on countries that can't. And the difficult political question is then, when do you exit? So countries like Ghana, which is now a middle-income country, but we still give money to, Zambia, which has just become middle-income, but we still give aid to. At what point do you say, actually we exit because their own tax revenue is strong enough? And there's quite an interesting academic literature about this. There's an economist called Martin Ravalian, who's now at the World Bank, who's written on this, and he says, he's done work that says, actually, until a country has about $4,000 per capita in national income, GNI per capita, you can't really expect it to redistribute its tax revenue towards a sort of sustainable welfare system for the poorest, and that there's an argument for aid until countries come to about $4,000 per capita. At the moment, most donors begin to take their aid away when GNI is more like $2,000 per capita. So it's very debated. It's very interesting, and a very debated point. And of course, countries can borrow. So some organisations like the World Bank will lend money to countries, but the countries have to pay it back. So then that's a question of, can those economies afford the debt created by borrowing from the World Bank? And that's, as we know, how much debt can you afford? It's about your forecast of growth, and it comes back to what's happening in the global economy too. It's a good question. It's very hard to...
Is there a country in Africa that would stop that thing because it has developed?
Angola.
Angola?
We closed our aid program in Angola. Lesotho, South Africa. So we, yes, quite. But we had an aid program in South Africa. We still have a small aid program focused on HIV in South Africa. And then I think the question will be then, when do we stop our program in Ghana? That's the next big question. Yes.
Maybe in a few years.
Maybe in a few years, yes. Yeah. And I think the politics of this are that I think our ministers will want to be able to tell the public, tell the UK taxpayer, stories about exit. They'll definitely want to say, we've exited. So I think it'll be very interesting to watch. Yeah.
Do your department continue to monitorize those states when you are going out from the state, when you are finishing the help?
Yeah. Well, India is an interesting example. So in India, what we've done is we've said half of the aid program, as we exit from India, half of the aid program is actually, it's slightly strange this, but anyway, we're investing it in small private sector organizations in the poorest states. So these are like Indian development banks. And the idea is that when India grows, we're going to take the money, we're going to get the money back. So it's not debt, it's equity investments, but that we're hoping that that will be returned. Yeah.
So you continue.
We could continue, yes, yes. And we also have a private sector. We have an organisation that we own that just makes investments in the private sector as well. But as a rule, we wouldn't. I think India was very special. I think as a rule we wouldn't do that. As a rule we would just exit. And we just stop. And that's what we've done mostly. Vietnam is an example where we're just exiting. Cambodia, we're just exiting.
Any questions about job opportunities?
Shall I explain?
Yes.
Okay. So we're a part of the civil service. So the UK civil service is open to anybody with a European passport. You don't have to be British. For economists, you have to pass an exam to be a government economist. And that is an exam run by our finance ministry. Once you pass the exam, you then can just get sent as a government economist to any department. So you could be sent to DFID or you could be sent to the Department of Health.
Can you ask?
You can express a preference, but you can't decide. But they move, so government economists get moved around a lot. So it's great. There are a lot of Italians in our finance ministry. It's a very interesting story about. It's really interesting story about. I'm not sure this is. Maybe you should turn the cameras off at this point. I don't know if this is well known, but I was talking to a colleague in our finance ministry who said that the Italians in the finance ministry always do very well in the end of year performance review. Always seem to be in the top quota. So that's very interesting. That's very good. Probably the quality of the economics teaching. So those opportunities you can see on the where would they be? They'd be on the finance ministry website. So HM Treasury. The website is HM Treasury. So then there's another scheme called it's called the Fast Streamer, and that is run by the Cabinet Office. So if you look at the Cabinet Office website, so again, every year they run like a concours exams. Yeah? So you can apply, and that's quite a competitive process. So at the moment, recruitment is very low because of the situation, but there are still opportunities. To work for DFID, so you can apply through those routes. So those are the core civil service routes, Cabinet Office or Finance Ministry. To work for DFID, you can also apply directly, and we tend to advertise in The Economist at the back of The Economist. We've just done a big recruitment round, but it's worth looking out. We have a new graduate scheme where we are employing new graduates. It's very competitive, it's very oversubscribed, and that's just been advertised, but it will be advertised again next year. But everything's on the website, so everything's there. But no, we have a strong commitment to bringing in a range of nationalities as well. It's important for us. Yeah.
E invece l'opportunità, diciamo, tramite la loro agenzia di lavorare, non so, in Africa, in queste... Ci senti proprio?
Yes, a lot. So about 1/3 of the jobs are abroad. Yeah. And there's a strong expectation that you would work abroad, and you now, because we have so many offices in fragile states and difficult places, when you join DFID, you have to be clear that you would be prepared to work in Afghanistan or Sudan. You can't say no. They're very clear that you're signing up for everything. You have to be someone who wants to work everywhere. Yeah. But no, lots of opportunity, and other parts of the government are interesting as well.
Quindi praticamente loro fanno il turnover per andare in questi paesi in cui lavorano.
How often you change the country when you, I mean,
3 years. 3 years.
Then you are sent back? Or
Normally back, sometimes. Many people get a bit addicted to it, so once they've been to one, they want to go for another. So actually, you tend to end up with 2 sort of careers: the people who are just going around the world, and the people who are still not home. I've done both. Yeah, yeah.
E come garantiscono la sicurezza a coloro che vanno a questi paesi?
Yeah, no, they don't. They try. Obviously, they spend money on security, and yeah, no. No, it's it is dangerous, but there's a lot of security and support. And if it's too dangerous, then they take you back. I mean, in Yemen earlier this year, they closed our office in Yemen. Everyone had to come back. For example, last year. Okay.
No more questions?
No, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It's very good to speak to a different audience and to speak to different people with different interests. Thank you very much. Thank you.